Hello, and welcome to Reclaim Democracy, Stories from the Oslo Freedom Forum. This is a special 4-part series from the Human Rights Foundation. I'm Casey Michel. Each year, the Human Rights Foundation brings together activists and dissidents at the Oslo Freedom Forum to call out injustice and expose threats to liberal democracy. And this series highlights some of the most compelling voices from this year's conference. Today, Part 3, AI for Activists. This past year, there has been tremendous growth in the field of artificial intelligence. What started off as chatbots has expanded into powerful tools that can create new images, write stories, and even do complex coding. There's a lot of promise for how AI can help humanity, but also concern for how it can be used to suppress human rights. Already, there have been troubling accounts of deep fakes being deployed to smear political opponents. Additionally, the issue of cybersecurity remains a constant concern, especially for those in the activist community who often need anonymity to protect themselves and their families. Our next guest is fully immersed in all of these issues.
My name is Arthur Holland Michel. I am a researcher and a journalist. I mostly write about emerging technologies.
Back in 2021, Arthur gave a speech at the Oslo Freedom Forum where he talked about just how powerful surveillance software has become and what that means for activists.
While you may have the truth on your side, you know, as we all know, that those in power who are threatened by these truths have something just as powerful on theirs, surveillance technology. But you've taken precautions. You wear a face mask, you use an encrypted messaging app. And when you leave the protest, you take a long, meandering route, just in case you're being followed. But you're being followed all the same. Not by a human or a drone, or any other one single physical surveillance device. You're being followed by software. And trust me when I say this, that is much, much worse.
Arthur Holland Michel, no relation to me, returned this year to Oslo to participate in a discussion on AI and surveillance. Before that, though, he sat down and spoke with Rob Sachs of FP Studios.
When we talk about autonomous weapons, people sometimes like to use the shorthand killer robots, or you think about like Skynet and Terminator and you know, whatever apocalyptic idea you have of, okay, the machines have turned against us, we're all gonna be in the Matrix or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
What's the reality versus what's sci-fi right now? And what should we really be worried about? And what's something that's like, okay, that's just Hollywood fiction?
So I love the question because I'm actually more interested in and in a way more concerned about the more boring forms of military artificial intelligence. For a long time, the discourse has focused on what are called fully autonomous, lethal autonomous weapons, things that can select targets without any human input, that can rove the battlefield, making human-like decisions. Not only is that still a sci-fi-esque conceit, but it also leaves out a whole category of technologies that may not be making human-style decisions or actually pulling the trigger, so to speak. And so in that sense, we haven't seen a ton of truly autonomous weapons being used in warfare today. There has been limited use of some drones that have some autonomous capabilities, especially in the last few minutes or seconds of a mission where they're given a target and really what they're doing is just guiding themselves into that target with a human supervising the whole time, and ideally if the machine were to take a wrong turn to call it off. What we're seeing a lot of, though, is militaries turning to forms of artificial intelligence, both old and new, that do things like propose targets for attacks, suggest what weapons to use in those attacks, suggest the most quote-unquote optimal way of getting to the target or what to do once you're there without going so far as to make the decision itself. So that's what I'm spending a lot of my time focusing on at the moment, even though it doesn't quite rise to the level of the Terminator type scenario, which I'm not ruling out that we might get there someday, but we need to talk about what's happening today as well and not lose sight of those real issues that are presenting themselves.
And when you talk about these life and death decisions, the military has this term collateral damage, which is this euphemism for, okay, people got killed or injured that we didn't mean to, but we'll try to minimize that. Is there a case to be made, though, that an algorithm that's taking into account all these variables, the size of a blast, the occupancy of a room, the structural integrity of a building, couldn't that be a way to reduce harm? Isn't it beneficial if there's a machine doing all these fast calculations that are giving military people those tools to make those decisions?
This is an argument we've heard a lot over the years. And not only is the argument that the machine can take in all sorts of forms of data that are beyond human reach and can calculate them in ways that a simple human mind cannot, but also that these machines are not subject to the emotions and the passions that may lead humans in warfare to deliberately kill civilians, to commit other sorts of atrocities. That's all well and good if it were the case that military's primary motivation in using these tools was to reduce civilian harm. That might be there in the background, but in most cases, militaries are developing and planning to deploy these technologies so that they can move more quickly, so that they can outwit the adversary, so that they can have more mass on the battlefield than the adversary, so that they can automate things that give them, in one way or another, an upper hand in the act of killing more of the enemy's guys than the enemy kills of theirs. And it is not clear to me that that is entirely compatible with the imperative of civilian protection. If militaries said that their primary motivation for developing these tools was to reduce to as close as possible to a nil the number of non-combatants who die or are harmed or are maimed in conflict, then I would see some more merit to that argument. But what the research is showing is that when a human has to use one of these tools in the chaotic context of warfare and has to use one of these tools in a very short amount of time, it's going to be very, very hard to account for all of the biases, the uncertainties that make that AI output potentially suboptimal, right? And that's what concerns me. It's that interaction between the human and the machine, where maybe if the human slowed down, the machine might help them in that sort of work of civilian protection. But we're talking about having 30 seconds to look at an AI output and know whether to trust it.
Is there a moment in your research or in your reporting where there is a particular incident that really demonstrated, okay, what we're being sold or what we're hearing is very different from the reality and the data that's being presented?
In many cases, the forms of artificial intelligence that we are seeing in conflict are related to surveillance and intelligence, which are in a way the most secretive prong of military operations. And so there is much more that we don't know than what we do know. But to answer your question about that moment of realization, for me, it really came from speaking to engineers, people who are building these tools. At the policy level, you heard a lot of generals and colonels and policy analysts and think tank types talking about how AI was going to be able to make decisions more quickly than humans and in a more reliable way. It was going to be able to take in more data. But when I started talking to the scientists, they were interested in what happens when an AI, for example, encounters something that it has never encountered before, something that did not figure in its training data sets in the case of a machine learning system. Because when these systems encounter something unexpected, they do very unexpected things. And I wasn't hearing a lot from scientists that these systems were super reliable. So there was a bit of a gap between how the policy space talked about these tools and the reality in the labs. So there are cases, for example, where targeting analysts used one of these civilian damage estimation tools. And it said that there were going to be a low number of civilian casualties from a particular strike. But there was an IED factory right next to the site of the particular strike. And the tool that they were using was not able to compute for secondary explosions that might result from the impact of the warhead. So then there was this sort of debate as to where the line of responsibility lies. I mean, they were following what the machine said, but the fact is no one was held certainly legally responsible for those harms, and it was a huge number of civilian casualties. That to me is a small window into the ambiguity that arises when a human and a machine share in a decision-making process. And it is a reality that's already happening on the ground, and that the legal system isn't particularly prepared for. And that's, of course, a worry.
More from Arthur Holland Michel after the break. This is Reclaim Democracy, Stories from the Oslo Freedom Forum. I'm Casey Michel, and we're back now with researcher and journalist Arthur Holland Michel.
So we're here at the Oslo Freedom Forum, where the theme is reclaiming democracy, how to empower activists to speak up against authoritarianism. Where's the concentric circle where those two kind of things intersect? Is it more something that activists should be trying to hold governments accountable in terms of being more transparent, or this is an actual threat, a physical threat to activists because they could be the quote unquote collateral damage, or is it both?
It's absolutely both. It's a combination of the two. There are serious implications for the democratic process when governments increasingly rely on, in many cases, mysterious, the technical term is black box tools to make governance decisions. If you think of democracy as being grounded in the process of human decision making, then handing that decision-making in one way over to a machine changes the nature of the game. A kind of simplified analogy is if before you wanted to follow a person's movements, you'd have to, get a couple of agents in a car to follow them around and drink coffee and eat donuts outside of their house and then follow them to wherever else they went. Now, when you can feed all of the data that we are all generating on a daily basis through the use of our phones or by walking through public space and being picked up on cameras, that creates, when fed through some of these algorithms, the capability to track everybody simultaneously at a very granular level. And the initial justification of, this is for counterterrorism. This is to crack down on violent crime. Incidentally, AI has not proven to be particularly good at really going after hardened criminals who know how to, avoid detection. But it has shown itself to be fairly effective at, and for example, identifying people in protests and things of that nature, which for our purposes here at this conference is very relevant. You have some right to anonymity when you participate in open discourse and democratic processes.
We asked our Oslo Freedom Forum attendees if they had any questions for Arthur as well. Here's what they had to share and his response.
My name is Kubang Enyam. I'm a resident of Oslo, and my question when it comes to surveillance and spyware and all of that is, have we gotten to the place in society and time where surveillance has overtaken our personal sovereignty and autonomy? Because everybody needs to be online these days. You can't do anything. You can't function in a society without being online. So how does this pose a threat to our privacy and our personal lives? Have we lost our right to privacy?
I think the biggest piece of evidence that we should look at is just what our privacy looks like on an everyday basis. I mean, and in that regard, there's a lot to be pessimistic about. But I wouldn't say that we have completely lost our privacy. There are still inefficiencies in these tools that are inherent, and it's not like activism has ended completely in our AI-enabled era. And I think a good starting point is to familiarize yourself with the technology, because part of what's powerful about AI in the context of surveillance is the chilling effect. We have these sci-fi informed notions of what AI is capable of. And when we think about those capabilities in the context of government surveillance, then we might assume that the government can see everything all the time, no matter what we do, and there's no hope of escape from that. And that will inevitably have a chilling effect where, you'll stop participating in protests, for example, which would be a win for governments. Even in cases, as may often be the case, that AI can give them some surveillance capability without giving them that all-seeing, Lord of the Rings style Eye of Sauron or whatever it is, where nothing goes unseen. So I think knowing what some of those limitations are can also free you in a certain respect.
Well, one other question about that, because you talked about there's vulnerabilities in that kind of work too, and you think about where things have evolved to with deep fakes, with images or voices. And, I've been reading articles saying we're at a point now where it's impossible to tell sometimes if something is a fake image. It's so good. Doesn't that kind of put us at the mercy of bad actors who are saying, here's photographic evidence of you doing something wrong, or I have your voice or your image? I mean, how can an activist in this era where you can have photographic or audio evidence virtually having you do anything, how can you keep yourself safe from someone who wants to prove you've done something wrong when they have that capability of doctoring it?
Yes and no. It's important to remember that governments and other malicious actors have had the ability to manipulate media for a very long time. They have done so for a very long time, and they've done so very, very effectively. There is certainly a difference now in terms of scale, where a government with 10 people in a room is able to generate disinformation, deepfakes, things of that nature at a truly unprecedented scale, which in the context of algorithms that always elevate the most controversial and shocking content over that which is more nuanced is an explosive combination. We see that all the time. But I think what gives me a little bit of hope in that regard is that there is so much awareness of deepfakes at the moment. And there is such an awakening to the real threats of manipulated media that there will be a very widespread response to these things. It's not happening in the dark. It's not happening in a way that you have to be a kind of niche academic to have a sense of what's going on. Everyone, sooner or later, will have some encounter with manipulated media that affects their life in one way or another. And that is the most powerful propellant for public awareness and action that I can think of. I'm not despite having been very pessimistic for the rest of this conversation, I'm not ready to throw in the towel on the protection of truth, even online. I think that humans are adaptable enough that we can get through this in a way, but boy, it's going to be very, very messy. And I think the last thing I'll say about that is that we've got to be very, very careful about how we regulate the tools of manipulated media, because we wouldn't want governments regulating in such a way that they get to decide what is true and what is not, because that obviously raises freedom of speech questions that need to be front and center in some of these conversations in a way that they aren't necessarily right now.
How do you get at trying to regulate or set some type of guiding principle?
Every government, practically every international organization has some variation on a set of AI ethics principles, guiding principles tending towards something that's not quite norms, but sort of pre-norm type concepts. In a way, that was the easy part. The real trick is in the implementation. So my advice for those wanting to propel the conversation forward, for those wanting to propel towards action, is to go to the scientific community. It's very easy for one's eyes to glaze over when people start talking about things like human-machine interfaces and trust calibration and things of that nature. But there is a big technical community that has been working on these things for a very, very, very long time. And what we don't want to see actors doing, be they private sector, civil society or government, is to make this stuff seem easier than it is. And to say, yes, we are going to have an anti-bias ministry in our government that will deal with AI bias. And everyone pats themselves on the backs and say, oh, great, well, then bias will be solved. Ideally, what I think would be more healthy is if a government said, look, there's this question of bias in AI, and we are going to admit to the public that we don't have all the answers, that we really are uncertain, that we are operating in a state of doubt with regards to this. And that is a way to invite collaboration.
You gave a speech here in 2021, 3 years ago. You opened it up with this very daunting scenario, someone walking outside and just being surveilled, and the idea of them being anonymous was kind of blown to shreds. That was 3 years ago. Are you even more freaked out now than you were then, or have things emerged since you gave that kind of, I don't want to say apocalyptic, but just a very scary scenario of this, an activist having no chance of being anonymous? Where have things gone, and where do you think they're going in terms of reclaiming our ability to interact in this world as an anonymous person?
I wouldn't say that there has been a step function like change since I gave that speech. The capabilities remain relatively similar. That was a pretty apocalyptic vision, which was informed in large part by technologies that were already either deployed in a narrow set of circumstances or at a sort of pre-deployment phase. We've definitely seen a more acquisition of these tools among governments in recent years. But I wouldn't say that we have, in these last 3 years, completely lost our privacy. And I have no reason to believe that people won't continue to find ways to hold governments to account, despite the vast array of tools that these governments have. Because also, activists, people who are targets of undemocratic, uncivil surveillance, have been contending with this stuff for a very, very long time. Governments have always had some formidable powers for tracking those, going back to the public square where there was always eyes looking at you from one way or another. So in a sense, what's new is old. And there is such drive when you look at a place like Oslo Freedom Forum. There is such passion and there's such drive among everyone you meet, everyone you interact with. AI can't hold a candle to that. It can try. One will have to adapt one's way of doing business in one way or another. But I think that's the thing that gives me most hope, is that, the human's still supreme in that regard.
That was Rob Sachs of FP Studios speaking with researcher and journalist Arthur Holland Michel. And that's it for this week's episode of Reclaim Democracy, Stories from the Oslo Freedom Forum. Our show is a production of FP Studios and the Human Rights Foundation, and our team includes Rosie Julin, Rob Sachs, Omar Al-Fatihi, Tara Everton, Natalia Sacedo, Anna Peterson, and Grace Douglas. If you like our show, please rate us or tell a friend. Next week, we conclude our series looking back at this year's Oslo Freedom Forum with a conversation on how artists and musicians are helping to foster unity and push for change.
I think that is a reminder of what we are, what we're made of, where we come from. Whatever has been taken away from us, we can reclaim.
We'll be back next week with more stories from the Oslo Freedom Forum. I'm Casey Michel. See you next time.